So after Rome's success in the 3 Punic Wars, it's becoming abundantly clear that the Republic isn't exactly working. Alright, so that's what attempts at reform means. There are going to be attempts to try and save this system, which has been around, if you believe the legends, it's been around for about 400 years. Alright, 400 years. Now the attempts at reform begin with the Gracchi brothers. Their last name was Gracchus, it's plural, so Gracchi. Now the lands that were seized during conquest were often purchased by the wealthy, and if they hired free men to work these lands, alright, if they hired free men, Roman law stipulated that they could be drafted into the legion for military service. The result was the purchase of more slaves, the rich getting richer, and commoners are held down by the trio of poverty, taxes, and military service. Now Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius and Gaius are the Gracchi brothers, pushed for reform. Tiberius had personally viewed wealthy landowners throwing poor farmers and shepherds off of their lands. He had witnessed this firsthand, and he argued that it was stupid to force soldiers to fight for this idea of Rome when there was a good chance that they would lose their homes. So when you see redistribution of public lands, his proposed reform of giving public land to the landless was vetoed. The word veto is Latin for I forbid, but he convinced his supporters to block new legislation until his law was brought up for a popular vote. This precedent meant that lawmakers could use their popularity to push through legislation that wasn't necessarily liked, and many were suspicious about the methods that he used. Now, ultimately, Tiberius was clubbed to death along with 300 other victims. All bodies were thrown into the Tiber River. And posterity, we kind of look at this as the end of the Republic. So we see one clubbed, the other stabbed. Doesn't turn out so well for them. Violence becomes a political tool. Instead of the pen, the sword is used in politics. Now again, attempts at reform. We're moving towards the end of the Republic here. Marius was a leader who came from new money, and he used his popularity for military service to become elected consul 6 straight times, which the Roman Constitution is supposed to prevent this. Alright, but it doesn't. He provided immediate citizenship to Italian allies, men known as Latins, who had helped him in battle, and he proposed that anyone who wanted to join the army could, not just the landowners. Now the reward for 25 years of service, because anyone can join, the equipment is standard, wealth isn't really a criteria anymore. The reward for 25 years of service would be land. And this is going to be tricky in the long term, because Rome is going to run out of good land to offer, and greed is going to get in the way. Now Marius became old, and command passed to Sulla, his former aide. He was elected consul, but not given military command to pursue an enemy because Marius, out of jealousy, had asked for it. When he bribed a tribune to get it, Sulla refused to surrender what he considered to be his army. Remember, because of the Punic Wars, generals stay with their armies for a longer period of time. Sulla views the legion as his, and he called on all legions to march on Rome. Huge breach because the Senate had control of the army within the walls of Rome, not the generals. He then allowed, air quotes, an election to take place. And the consul who's elected, Cinna, who became a guy named Caesar's father-in-law, didn't like him. Alright, Cinna didn't like Sulla, but he promised to be loyal to him. So we see he invaded Rome, got elected dictator, and then Sulla gave Rome back to Cinna and restored the Senate, but this proved that the real power of Rome lay with the generals. The army is not loyal to this idea of SPQR. Rome is becoming more and more of a fading idea. Now, all of this instability will lead to internal rebellion. Now, Roman conquest brought thousands of new slaves into Roman lands, and although their treatment usually involved things like beatings and starvation, freed slaves became Roman citizens and were afforded all the rights of citizenship. This meant that with the snap of a finger, those former slaves would simply, and this is a quote, they'd simply melt into the local population within one or at the most 2 generations. Slaves understood their treatment, and they'd rebel as a means of protest and obtaining freedom. Now, things came to a head in what was called the Servile War, or the Spartacus Slave Revolt. A majority of Rome's army was off fighting one another because the right-hand man of Sulla, a man named Pompey, was in Spain fighting an ally of Marius. There's just a lot of infighting. Another force was off in the east. So Rome is kind of ripe for internal attack. These slaves were what we call gladiators. They fought with a sword called a gladius, so gladiator. They are skilled fighters who are trained to fight to the death. Now, the first competition goes back to the year 264 BC, and the most successful ones gained a popular following. No matter their celebrity, they were still viewed as the lowest rungs of Roman society. In the year 73 BC, 78 gladiators escaped from the most notorious training school. This is south of Rome. They escaped with weapons. They stole them from a butcher shop, and they began to head north. They elected Spartacus as their leader, and he was an amazing strategist. Ultimately, Spartacus's army grew to 70,000 strong, and he tried to lead them through the Alps so that everyone could go home to either Thrace or Gaul. Unfortunately, they turned back. We think they were intoxicated with success. They turned back to face the Roman forces. Sulla's junior lieutenant was a man named Crassus. He was given the task of ending the rebellion. Now, his first assault failed, but the second one succeeded due to the arrogance of the gladiators. 6,000 of them were crucified on the Via Appia, or the Appian Way, the main road leading into Rome. This was partially seen as a victory for Pompey, whose forces had mobilized to attack the slaves, and he was given credit for it. So Crassus, Pompey, not really fans of one another. So we've seen that loyalty shifts to generals, and all of this constant fighting leads to revolt, leads to rebellion. Sulla dies. So the Triumvirate is now formed. Triumvirate means rule of 3, and it was created after the death of Sulla to prevent another dictatorship. This is purely a political alliance that was forged between political rivals. Now Crassus, he's the bank. He's the money. He had just successfully put down the slave revolt, and he built up a sizable fortune by owning rental properties, farmland, and silver mines. He actually did the work, but Pompey got the credit. He was Sulla's right-hand man and was successful in his campaigns in Iberia, which is now Spain. His biggest flaw was that he had a habit of taking credit for the work of others, but he's still viewed as a conqueror, and the people love him. He and Crassus are both elected consul, and Pompey went off and conquered Palestine, so there's more land in the east that's added to the Republic. So Triumvirate, rule of 3. The third piece of the puzzle is Gaius Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar held political office, but he ran up some pretty serious debts. He got himself appointed governor of Hispania on the Iberian Peninsula, but his creditors tried to confiscate his luggage when he was leaving, meaning they wanted to get him to pay up now. The wealthy Crassus guaranteed Caesar's debts, and Caesar made enough money as governor to officially pay off all of his debts. Once he was back in Rome, he called together a meeting of Crassus, Pompey, and himself, and suggested a private alliance. If elected consul in the year 59 BC, Caesar agreed to push forward whatever laws the two of them wanted. Crassus and Pompey still hate each other, but they agreed to it anyway. Caesar's daughter married Pompey's daughter to seal the deal. Now understand, this triumvirate is meant to split rule and prevent total dictatorship.